Hello，大家好，我是 Jeff 啊。这个2点的讲话现在还在等待啊。我现在有2个平台给大家看一下，一个是这个大家可以看到啊，一个是这个美联储自己的网站，我是从美联储自己的网站进到他们的这个官方直播链接上，也在等待。另外一个我在这个 YouTube 上找的，大家可以看到留言非常多的各类留言非常多的，也是在说今天的2点也正在等啊。这个是 Yahoo Finance 在 YouTube 上直接直播，所以两边呢2个平台我都在等啊，因为现在应该是由于一些原因还没有开始，所以这个大家也可以帮我看点，如果大家那边已经比如说已经有开始的这种情况，可以留言告诉我。目前来说呢，还没有，我这边看到的应该是还没有开始啊。大家可以看到很多的这种，经常看到很多韩国人在这留言，留韩文，这个应该是还没有开始，很多人都在等他这样的一场讲话，所以我们可以还稍微有一些时间，可以稍微再看看股票啊。如果这个有什么关于这个讲话的内容啊，也可以留言，大家可以留言一起讨论啊。整个市场现在基本上就是一条直线在横盘啊，大家可以看到尤其是2点之后，基本上没有任何的这个股指上面的变化，就是在等着今天或者这一周比较重要的这个鲍威尔的表态啊。咱们呢拭目以待，多给这个鲍威尔一点时间。我不知道为什么他们现在还没有开始啊。
Noise and
开始了。
feedback. I will recognize members verbally, and members retain the right to seek
Recording in
recognition
progress.
verbally. In regular order, members will be
已经开
recognized
始了啊，
in
各位，所以我们现在
seniority
要全屏
for questions.
播放这个讲话，
If you
然后
are
在我们自
remote
己的这个直播
and
房
want to
间
be
里面去
recognized
这个
outside of regular
去聊
order,
天。
you may identify that in several ways. You may use the chat function to send a request. You may send an email to the majority staff, or you may unmute your mic to seek recognition. Obviously, we do not want people talking over each other, so my preference is that members use the chat function or email to facilitate formal verbal recognition. Committee staff will ensure that I am aware of the request and I will recognize you. Now, at the request of the House, down from 10, and the live stream will begin when I get down to 1. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Good afternoon. The committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. I am pleased to welcome Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell. Thank you for being here today. Today's hearing will examine the Fed's response to the economic crisis caused by the coronavirus pandemic, the current state of the recovery, and what steps we must take to ensure a strong, sustainable, and equitable economic future. The pandemic resulted in the loss of over 22 million jobs. In March 2020, Congress passed the CARES Act, which allocated up to $500 billion for emergency lending by the Fed, including for loans to small and medium-sized businesses, as well as states and municipalities. The lending programs established by the Fed for these recipients helped prevent some economic damages, but were limited in their effectiveness. The Fed's Municipal Liquidity Facility sought to provide much-needed emergency lending to state and local governments, but the program's restrictions limited its impact at a time when many states and localities were in dire need. During the crisis, state and local governments shed 1.5 million jobs, and there is little evidence that the Municipal Liquidity Facility saved jobs or led to their return. The Fed's Main Street lending program similarly imposed restrictions that made its loans unattractive to struggling businesses and partner banks. Today's hearing will help us learn from the shortcomings of these programs and the Fed's efforts to improve its future crisis response capabilities. The Fed has admirably highlighted the toll of economic crisis on the American people and its unequal impact on Black, brown, and low-income workers. The Fed's report last month on the economic well-being of the United States households in 2020 shows that Black and brown Americans suffered disproportionate economic pain last year. I look forward to hearing from Chair Powell today on how we can continue to make the recovery more equitable. Congress and the Biden-Harris administration have accelerated the recovery. As Chair Powell predicted in late March, the dramatic ramp-up in the vaccination campaign, which occurred as a result of the Biden administration's leadership, with support from Congress in the American Rescue Plan, has enabled, and I quote him here, us to reopen the economy sooner than might have been expected. The American Rescue Plan also delivered desperately needed financial assistance, which has been and will continue to be a lifeline for American families. The American Rescue Plan provided direct relief checks, extended unemployment, and increased health care access. And we have seen the results of that extraordinary action. Over the last 4 months, the economy has added over 1.6 million jobs, and new unemployment insurance claims have dropped significantly. As Chair Powell predicted in March, Congress's aggressive action to provide fiscal relief through the American Rescue Plan is accelerating the return to full employment. But there's more work to do. There are still 7.6 million fewer jobs than before the pandemic, with Black and brown Americans still unemployed at disproportionately high rates. As Chair Powell said earlier this year, to raise Americans' standard of living over the long term, Congress must make investments to increase the productivity of the economy. I agree. And Congress is working to do just that. The American Jobs Plan and the American Families Plan will make the investments we need to ensure a strong, sustainable, and equitable economic recovery. The American Jobs Plan will sustainably modernize our transportation infrastructure, bring affordable household access to millions of Americans, build schools and housing, upgrade water and power systems, and create well-paying jobs for essential home care workers. The American Families Plan will invest in preschool and higher education, allow parents to return to the workforce by providing child care assistance, and support families by extending the American Rescue Plan's expanded child tax credit. Congress is working hard, crafting legislation to enact the American Jobs Plan and the American Families Plan so that we will build back better in our recovery from the pandemic. I look forward to hearing from Chair Powell about what else we can do to ensure that our country's economic policy is effective, efficient, and equitable. Thank you for being here, Chair Powell. I now yield to the ranking member for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I also welcome Federal Reserve Chairman Powell. Thank you for being with us, and look forward to having an interesting conversation about the state of our economy. But I first want to begin by making sure to reiterate a point that we've been making for over a year, and that is that House Democrats still refuse to hold a hearing on the origin of COVID-19. If this virus did in fact leak from the Wuhan lab, by the way, which a growing mountain of evidence now indicates is the real possibility, everyone in this country and around the world who has been touched by this evil virus deserves to know what happened and how it happened. Given the Chinese Communist Party's documented cover-up and lies, every member of the subcommittee should agree. If this is a man-made virus, then this is exponentially worse than Chernobyl. Yet not a single hearing by the House Democrat majority. 209 House Republicans wrote Speaker Pelosi asking that the committees of jurisdiction simply hold hearings. I've asked repeatedly that this select subcommittee hold a hearing on this important topic. We were told that the Science Committee is looking into it. Mr. Chairman, every single Republican member of the Science Committee signed this letter to Speaker Pelosi. The Science Committee hasn't even scheduled a hearing on this subject. Not a single committee has indicated clearly that Speaker Pelosi has sent word that the House will not investigate the origins of COVID-19. We are amid a long global competition with China. Much of the world must decide whose values to espouse and with whom to align. Speaker Pelosi and the House of Representatives should not be covering up for China's lies and potential crimes. We should be coming together on a bipartisan basis to search for those answers and shine the light of transparency on the origin of this virus to the world, and to do it on a bipartisan basis. I urge you to reconsider and schedule a hearing on the origins of COVID-19 without further delay, Mr. Chairman. Now let's get back to the focus of today's hearing, the economic crisis. Chairman Powell, welcome back to this subcommittee. We appreciate your openness and accessibility during these challenging times. Inflation has been defined as too much money chasing too few goods. It also happens to be a nearly exact description of the Biden economic plan. Last year, Congress worked together on a bipartisan basis to provide much-needed relief from the government-imposed lockdowns. America did not know a whole lot about this novel coronavirus, and we did not at the time have a vaccine. Some in Congress used this crisis to spend trillions of dollars on things that had little or nothing to do with COVID. We still have hundreds of billions of dollars from the many relief packages that are still left unspent. We also learned that the revenue shortfalls some predicted state and local governments would face were dramatically inaccurate. Congress provided hundreds of billions in aid to states that are running billions of dollars in surpluses. This is borrowed money, keep in mind. Republicans have a clear set of policies for the economy. Since we passed the initial CARES Act last year on a bipartisan basis, Republicans at the national and state level have called for schools to be reopened to get in-person learning going again. We've called for an end to enhanced unemployment and other policies that discourage people from going back to work. We called for full, from the beginning, support for Operation Warp Speed, because that is what got us not one, not two, but now 3 safe and effective vaccines. We've also called for safely reopening our economy and for repurposing the unused COVID funds for real infrastructure, not with job-killing taxes that would actually slow our economy down even more. We're focused on growing our economy and increasing supply of workers, expanded investment, and for bringing back jobs to America, strengthening supply chains, and returning the American people to a country that is open and free. 25 Republican governors have moved to end the enhanced unemployment insurance program that is clearly causing so many of these labor shortages we see around the nation. The Biden inflation agenda of too much money chasing too few goods is causing major harm to hardworking families. A $1.9 trillion COVID bill that had almost nothing to do with COVID, but airdropped more borrowed money into the economy while restricting supply. Canceling the Keystone Pipeline. Siding with teachers' union bosses to keep schools closed when the science said to open up the schools. Causing long-term damage to millions of our youngest children. Extending the enhanced unemployment insurance and paying people more to stay home than to work. And alarmingly, President Biden actually wants to give away our intellectual property for the vaccine to China. On top of that, he's proposed a $3.5 trillion tax hike that will crush American workers, small businesses, and family farms. He wants a higher tax rate than communist China. Add to that, he wants another $4 trillion of spending. Too much money chasing too few goods. Welcome to the Biden inflation agenda. The Washington Post lead story yesterday said, quote, the U.S. economy is emerging from the coronavirus pandemic markedly transformed as businesses and consumers struggle to adapt to a new landscape with higher prices, fewer workers, and a range of inconveniences. They go on to say, what Americans are encountering, though, is almost unrecognizable from just 16 months ago. Prices are up. Housing is scarce. It takes months longer than normal to get furniture, appliances, and numerous parts delivered. And there is a great dislocation between millions of unemployed workers and millions of vacant jobs. The Washington Post is hardly a conservative news outlet. Larry Summers, top economic advisor to both President Clinton and President Obama, has been warning since February that President Biden's agenda is inflationary. The consumer price index is up the most since 2008. The 6.2% increase in the producer price index is the highest on record. Milk is up 5%. Bacon is up 13%. Used cars are up 30%. Transportation up 16%. The list goes on, unfortunately. Housing prices are soaring, and economists are warning of a rental crisis. The cost of building new homes has made it prohibitive for home builders, restricting supply while flooding the economy with cash. Inflation is outpacing wage gains the past few months. In the first 5 months of the Biden presidency, 500,000 fewer jobs were created than in the last 5 months of the Trump administration. And the Biden administration started with approved vaccines already in place on day one. Chairman Powell, these Biden inflationary policies have put you in a tough spot. I have confidence, Chairman Powell, that the Fed has tools to deal with inflation, but those tools are harsh. Raising interest rates and constricting the money supply, they work. But as we saw with Paul Volcker, it causes tremendous pain. The job of taming inflation belongs to Congress and this administration. Take the $4 trillion in new spending proposals off the table. Send a message to the markets that we will do a bipartisan infrastructure bill that is paid for with unused COVID relief money. There's plenty of it. Let's agree to end the enhanced UI. Drop the massive tax hikes. President Biden proposed shipping jobs overseas with many of his agenda items. Why don't we reverse that? Why don't we come together on a bipartisan basis to focus on getting a long and sustained recovery from this pandemic? That would be a good start. Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Scalise. Chair Powell, please rise and raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record show that the witness answered in the affirmative. Without objection, your written statement will be made part of the record. Chair Powell, you're now recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Cleburne. Thank you, Ranking Member Scalise and other members of the Select Subcommittee for the opportunity to update you on our ongoing measures to address the hardship wrought by the pandemic. Since we last met, the economy has shown sustained improvement. Widespread vaccinations have joined unprecedented monetary and fiscal policy actions in providing strong support for the recovery. Indicators of economic activity and employment have continued to strengthen, and real GDP this year appears to be on track to post its fastest rate of increase in decades. Much of this rapid growth reflects the continued bounce back in activity from depressed levels. The sectors most adversely affected by the pandemic remain weak, but have shown improvement. Household spending is rising at a rapid pace, boosted by the ongoing reopening of the economy, fiscal support, and accommodative financial conditions. The housing sector is strong, and business investment is increasing at a solid pace. In some industries, near-term supply constraints are restraining activity. As with overall economic activity, conditions in the labor market have continued to improve, although the pace has been uneven. The unemployment rate remained elevated in May at 5.8%, and this figure understates the shortfall in employment, particularly as participation in the labor market has not moved up from the low rates that have prevailed for most of the last year. Job gains should pick up in coming months as vaccinations rise, easing some of the pandemic-related factors currently weighing them down. The economic downturn has not fallen equally on all Americans, and those least able to shoulder the burden have been the hardest hit. In particular, despite progress, joblessness continues to fall disproportionately on lower-wage workers in the service sector and on African Americans and Hispanics. The Fed pursues monetary policy aimed at fostering a strong, stable economy that can improve economic outcomes for all Americans. Those who've historically been left behind stand the best chance of prospering in a strong economy with plentiful job opportunities. And our economy will be stronger and perform better when everyone can contribute to and share in the benefits of prosperity. Inflation has increased notably in recent months. This reflects, in part, the very low readings from early in the pandemic falling out of the calculation, the pass-through of price increases in oil prices to consumer energy prices, the rebound in spending as the economy continues to reopen, and the exacerbating factor of supply bottlenecks, which have limited how quickly production in some sectors can respond in the near term. As these transitory supply effects abate, inflation is expected to drop back toward our longer-run goal. The pandemic continues to pose risks to the economic outlook. Progress on vaccinations has limited the spread of COVID-19 and will likely continue to reduce the effects of the public health crisis on the economy. However, the pace of vaccinations has slowed, and new strains of the virus remain a risk. Continued progress on vaccinations will support a return to more normal economic conditions. The Fed's policy actions are guided by our dual mandate to promote maximum employment and stable prices for the American people, along with our responsibilities to promote the stability of the financial system. In response to the crisis, we took broad and forceful measures to more directly support the flow of credit in the economy and to promote the stability of the financial system at the onset of the pandemic. Our actions, taken together, helped to unlock more than $2 trillion of funding to support businesses large and small, nonprofits, and state and local governments between April and December of 2020. This, in turn, helped keep organizations from shuttering and put employers in a better position to keep workers on and to hire them back as the recovery continues. Our facilities were designed as backstops to private credit marks, not as replacements. Once lenders and investors understood that borrowers would have access to emergency loans, conditions improved. For example, yields and spreads on municipal bonds started to fall dramatically following the announcement that some municipal notes would be eligible at our money fund facility and that we were opening the municipal liquidity facility. This is detailed in the charts accompanying my testimony. Over the succeeding months, issuance of municipal debt surged. Over the period from April to December 2020, state and local governments and other muni issuers borrowed almost $380 billion in the private markets at extremely attractive rates, and 2020 as a whole saw the highest volume of municipal issuance on record. We've deployed these lending tools to an unprecedented extent, and our emergency lending tools require the approval of the Treasury and are available only in unusual and exigent circumstances, such as those brought on by the crisis. Many of these programs were supported by funding from the CARES Act. Those facilities provided essential support through a very difficult year, and they are now closed. We continue to analyze the facility's efficacy and to review the lessons learned from their establishment and operation. And additional analysis is included in my written testimony. To wrap up, we understand that our actions affect communities, families, and businesses across the country. Everything we do is in service to our public mission. We at the Fed will do everything we can to support the economy for as long as it takes to complete the recovery. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair Powell. Each member will now have 5 minutes for questions. The chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Chair Powell, as you've suggested in the past, our delivery of direct assistance to the American people, and I'm quoting you here, is going to wind up very much accelerating the return of full employment. You have also observed, and I'm quoting you again, the economic downturn has not fallen equally on all Americans. We have observed that in our own communities, and I know the Fed has extensive data that are backing it up and is looking closely at steps that can be taken to address economic disparities. Now, my question is, why do you believe that economic equity is important for the strength of our economy as a whole and necessary to successfully fulfill the Fed's core mandate of price stability and maximum employment?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So disparities in economic outcomes along various lines have been a persistent and growing feature of our economy for several decades. We can contribute to addressing those through our tools. It does, of course, take a much broader set of policies from the legislature to really make significant progress on this. So what we can do really is to focus principally on the employment mandate and to assure that we achieve maximum employment, which we now define as a broad and inclusive goal, meaning we will not just look at the headline numbers for unemployment, we'll look at all kinds of measures of unemployment, including unemployment and employment for various groups, ethnic groups, gender groups, and things like that. We'll look at it as a broad and inclusive goal. We will also, under our new framework, respond to shortfalls only in full employment. We will not raise interest rates preemptively because we think employment is too high, because we fear the possible onset of inflation. Instead, we will wait for actual evidence of actual inflation or other imbalances. So that's the most important thing that we can do. I think the point is that there's a growing realization really across the political spectrum that we need to achieve more inclusive prosperity. Real incomes at the lower end of the spectrum have stagnated relative to those at the top. Mobility across income spectrums has declined in the United States and now lags that of most other advanced economies. These things hold us back as an economy and as a country. And I do think these are important issues that relate to the overall performance of the economy and therefore are in scope for us to analyze and call out.
Well, thank you for that. One of the primary goals of the Select Subcommittee is to ensure that our response to the pandemic is effective, efficient, and equitable. Now, I appreciate that the Fed, under your leadership, recognizes the importance of all three of these attributes for future economic strength. I'm not a social scientist by any means, but I am well aware that in past recoveries, we don't have to go all the way back to the 1930s to see this phenomenon. We saw it taking place in 2009. That recovery was slow because I feel we did too little when we should have been going bigger and bolder, which we've done here. And I appreciate the fact that you are recognizing that and helping to build America back with, under this rescue plan, this families plan, all these things that are necessary to make sure that all elements in our society come back, not just where we were. Handle this, and I look forward to continue to work with you on that. And with that, I'll yield to the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Powell, Chairman Powell, if we can go back to the pre-pandemic and look at first where the economy was, how it was performing. Were we experiencing a record economic expansion prior to the pandemic?
Longest in our history.
And so we saw the lowest overall unemployment. Is that correct?
That is, yeah. Well, since in 50 years, really.
Since the 1960s, let's say.
That's right.
How about how it was affecting everybody? I know we've had some that try to say it didn't impact all groups. We've seen other numbers. I've surely seen other numbers that showed that everybody benefited, but especially those lowest level entry levels. We saw record startups, African American unemployment, Hispanic unemployment at all-time records. Is that what you saw as well?
Yes, and really that started to happen in the last 2 or 3 years of the very long expansion, which shows you the benefit of a very strong labor market. We saw all-time record low unemployment since 1972 or so when we started tracking it for African Americans and very low for Hispanics as well.
All right, and obviously after the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act passed, that is when we started seeing that happen. In fact, right before the bill was signed into law, we saw major companies, AT&T started, and then every day there would be more announcements of companies announcing bonuses and increased wages for their employees because of a more competitive tax rate globally. Did you see that same thing?
We don't comment on the effects of particular bills, as you can imagine, of any kind.
I'll give you that, and obviously there's enough documentation of those reports as people would announce that they were doing it strictly because America had become competitive again. We had the highest corporate rate in the world. We made ourselves not only competitive, we had a 21% rate when the world average was 23%, and then we saw all of those great benefits. We also saw record high markets, didn't we?
We did, yeah, I guess.
So when we saw the government-ordered lockdowns, whether it's businesses, schools, didn't that ultimately hurt this record-setting economy?
I don't know that I can say that. I mean, I think of course, the economy was very hard hit by the pandemic, and it's assigned to others to decide how we should have reacted. It's really not something that the Fed has expertise in or the ability to judge.
Would you say that the lockdowns were caused by a reaction to COVID COVID-19 becoming a global pandemic?
Yes. Yeah.
And did COVID-19 come from China?
I don't know.
Well, hopefully this committee will have that hearing on the origin of COVID. We won't have to wonder about it. Obviously, there's a lot of data out there that indicates not only did it start in China, but that it also started in the Wuhan lab. And whether it was intentional or accidental, that is a question no one should have doubt about when we could be having those hearings. So we'll continue to call for that. But you could see that straight line between the pandemic hitting from this virus that came from China, and then the shutdown that had a devastating impact not only on lives, over 600,000 in America, millions worldwide, but also on this economic crisis that we're dealing with. Now I want to turn to the inflation crisis that we're seeing. As you can see right behind me, we've seen a dramatic increase in the cost of many household items, everyday items that families buy. Milk up 5%, bacon up 13%, gas up 56%, used cars up 30%, as we're seeing a shortage of products, harder for people to get products, supply chain backups, harder to get workers. We're seeing, as the result of that, about a 5% inflation rate recently. So I would ask you, Chairman Powell, is 5% inflation acceptable to you?
No, it's certainly not.
So clearly we want to address this crisis. Now, when you look with the unemployment crisis, there's 9.3 million job openings right now, which is a record high, yet the economy only added back 500,000 jobs in May. We've seen the enhanced unemployment being a big factor in paying people. 40% of the people that are getting these checks are getting more money not to work than work. That was a policy decision made here in Washington, a very flawed one. You're seeing many states try to address it, but ultimately, as we have this labor shortage, as it's creating supply chain backups, as it's starting to get worse, especially on the inflation side, Chairman Powell, will the economy ever reach a full pre-pandemic level if this labor shortage continues?
Well, if it continues, I strongly suspect that labor supply and job creation will be moving up well over the rest of this year.
And I think that'll follow, as you see many governors, half the governors in the country now have decided to end on their own that enhanced unemployment, and that is getting people back to work in those states. Unfortunately, some states want to continue paying people not to work, and that's causing inflation in other areas. Hopefully we can confront this, address it. I wish you well as you look at the tools you have available to you, but hopefully we as policymakers get this right as well. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank Jim for yielding back. I'm sure he's going to join me later in making sure we increase the minimum wage so we can do something about the lower.
There is no minimum wage right now, Mr. Chairman. They're being given bonuses to people to go back to work.
Yeah, I don't think the minimum wage people got bonuses. Or did they?
I've seen wages in almost every state go up well above minimum wage.
Almost every state. Miss South Carolina, I'm sure they call it Louisiana.
I know my restaurants in the New Orleans area cannot find workers, and they're looking and paying more than they were pre-pandemic, and New Orleans has got the best food in the world. I'm sure South Carolina's not far behind, but they would like to get those workers back too.
Yeah, Gallagher is a little better. With that, I'll give 5 minutes to Ms. Maloney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. It's good to see you again, Chairman Powell. I want to start by asking about the Fed's monetary policy and inflation in particular. I'm very concerned that the Fed is going to raise rates too early, which would seriously harm the economic recovery. As you stated last week, much of the recent rise in inflation had actually been expected. I strongly believe that the recent spike in inflation will only be temporary, and that shouldn't cause the Fed to raise interest rates too soon. In the early months of the pandemic, prices fell incredibly low, so now a year later, the year-over-year rise in prices looks very high. But that was only because prices fell to artificially low levels last year at this time. This is something that everyone saw coming for many months, so shouldn't come as a surprise at all. How much of the recent rise in inflation do you attribute to artificially low prices from early in the pandemic, and how much do you attribute to other effects like supply bottlenecks, pushing up prices, and a genuine rebound in economic activity?
Well, a pretty substantial part, or perhaps all, of the overshoot in inflation comes from categories that are directly affected by the reopening of the economy, such as used cars and trucks in particular. There's sort of a perfect storm of very strong demand and weak supply due to the reopening of the economy and various factors. We see airplane tickets, we see hotel prices, we see other things. Those are things that we would look to stop going up and ultimately to start to decline as these situations resolve themselves. They don't speak to a broadly tight economy into the kind of thing that has led to high inflation over time. I will say that these effects have been larger than we expected, and they may turn out to be more persistent than we've expected. But the incoming data are very much consistent with the view that these are factors that will wane over time, and that inflation will then move down toward our goals, and we'll be monitoring that carefully. Of course, we're prepared to use our tools as appropriate if that turns out not to be the case, to guide inflation to 2%.
Thank you. Let me follow up on that, because we know that inflation statistics are fundamentally flawed right now due to the pandemic. We typically measure inflation using a basket of goods and services that represents what people usually purchase, but the pandemic completely scrambled what everyone was spending money on. People weren't traveling or going out to restaurants, so spending on those items stopped entirely, while spending on groceries surged dramatically. As a result, a lot of economists questioned whether we should be relying so heavily on inflation statistics that we know don't represent what people are actually spending money on. So my question is, do you have any concerns with relying on traditional inflation statistics, which we know are unreliable right now in setting monetary policy?
I think the overall point is that the data that we're looking at in the labor market and for inflation and for growth, it's in such an unusual setting of reopening the economy. We have to be very humble about our ability to really try to draw a signal out of it, and it may take some patience to see what really is happening. Specifically on inflation, you're really talking about consumer price inflation, the CPI. We actually use at the Fed PCE, personal consumption expenditure inflation. And that the basket is actually updated on a monthly basis for PCE, and that's one of its more attractive features from our standpoint. Still, at a time like this, when people are changing their consumption patterns in ways that are outside of experience, I would say there's also a challenge there. Even though our measure is in fact updating monthly in terms of its basket.
Switching gears, I want to ask about the Main Street lending program. It seems clear that both the Main Street program and the municipal program generally improved credit access. Fed officials have acknowledged that the Main Street program would likely have been more productive with different bank incentives and more generous terms. And as you know, the eligibility threshold for the municipal program excluded many cities and counties that were deeply affected by the pandemic. What do you believe are the most important adjustments the Fed could make to the Main Street lending program to make it more effective in future crises?
So I would say the Main Street lending program overall was effective. It made a couple thousand loans, and it helped a lot of businesses. So if I could take away a lesson there, it is that it's very difficult to reach small businesses across America, and I would look to the PPP program and things like that. A lot of these very small businesses didn't need unforgivable loans. These were statutorily unforgivable. They could not be forgiven. And so I would look in that direction going forward. In terms of the municipal loan liquidity facility, I think that the overall assessment of that is that it was a resounding success. And the test of it is not how many loans we made. The test of it is how much lending took place. The municipal markets were collapsing. There was no lending going on. The people who put their money in those funds that wind up making all the loans were taking their money out. We announced the facility, and all of that turned around. And by through much of last year, municipalities, states had great access to market, including ones with relatively low ratings. Record amounts of borrowing took place at low rates. So it really worked. I mean, it really stands for the proposition that a backstop is better than a direct loan in a lot of cases. So we would look at it that way, and I think that's the way it's generally seen.
My time has expired. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding back. The chair now recognizes Dr. Miller Mix.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Powell, thank you so much for coming before us today and for your testimony. There has been, I think, first and foremost, that the improving economic position we see today, do you think that it would be in existence without Operation Warp Speed and 3 safe and effective vaccines?
I think that the vaccines and the widespread adoption of them are absolutely essential to the recovery.
Thank you. And currently, about 40% of workers on enhanced unemployment are paid more than they did while they were working. Coincidentally, there is a labor shortage. In my home state of Iowa, as of May 2021, 87,000 workers dropped out of the labor force since February 2020, a 5% decrease in the size of Iowa's workforce. Notwithstanding, employers in my state cannot find workers, and these are jobs that are greater than $15 an hour. Even some employers cannot find people to work at salaries of between $80,000 and $130,000. As Governor Brainerd pointed out earlier this year, true unemployment is far higher than the headline rate, and the labor force participation rate is nearly 6 percentage points below where it was at the beginning of the 21st century. Shouldn't we be doing everything we can to incentivize work for our own citizens? Shouldn't we be looking at bringing in additional unskilled workers into this country at a time when we have a labor shortage of skilled workers?
So I'll try to get to answer. So I think a number of things we think are weighing on labor supply right now, and those are things that should be expected to abate and wane and go away over the course of coming months. So we should be seeing our way to strong job creation, we think, as the year goes on. And there I'm thinking of a significant number of people still report themselves as not wanting to work because of being afraid of being infected or being afraid of carrying the infection to somebody they may live with who's vulnerable. Also, schools not being open, that's weighing on participation by caretakers. And then the unemployment insurance may be interacting with some of those other factors and causing people to go on with their job search longer. There's another thing, though. The very quick job gains of the early recovery essentially involve going back to your old job. That's not so much what's happening now. Now it's actually finding new jobs, and that's a matching function that is more labor intensive and time consuming, and there may be a bit of a speed limit on that. We expect, though, as I said, a lot of progress to go forward. On immigration, it's something we really isn't in our bailiwick, and so I try to stay at a high level on a question like that.
And President Biden promised not to raise taxes on anyone making under $400,000 a year, but inflation, as has already been noted, has increased dramatically. And I realize you use the PCE rather than the CPI, but it's over 5% and is most insidious and regressive tax affecting low-income minority families, hardworking taxpayers, and seniors on a fixed income. You stated recently that the current inflation surge is likely to be transitory. Does likely mean greater than a 95% chance, a 50% chance, or do you have any level of confidence in that prediction?
I have a level of confidence in that prediction. What I would have been saying, though, is that it's very hard to say what the timing of that will be. When will these bottlenecks disappear? When will there be enough microchips? We saw what happened in the lumber business. Prices have come way down, but they're still pretty high. When will the used car markets get back into equilibrium? So it's hard to say exactly when it will be and exactly how large the effects will be. But honestly, if you look behind the headline and look at the categories where these prices are really going up, you'll see that it tends to be areas that are directly affected by the reopening. That's something that we'll go through over a period that will then be over, and it should not leave much of a mark on the ongoing inflation process. So there's no reason why it should leave a mark on inflation, say, a year or so ahead, because we should be through it then.
Thank you. And finally, the financial report of the United States government published annually by the Treasury Department says unambiguously the current fiscal path is unsustainable. On our current path, debt is projected to exceed 6 times GDP by the end of the century, and annual government spending will exceed 50% of GDP. Do you agree with the conclusions of this report? And if so, isn't this an additional and one of our greatest avoidable crises that our country currently faces?
I think unsustainable just means that the debt is growing faster than the economy. That's been the case for a long time, and I don't think that's controversial. I think the point I would make is that the time to work on that problem will come, and that time is when employment is high, unemployment is low, economic activity is strong, taxes are rolling in. That's the right time to go to work on a longer-term program that gradually moves us back to, primary balance and ultimately, you just have to get the GDP growing faster than the debt, and it has to do that for an extended period of time. That's how countries get back to a sustainable path.
And to be mindful of their spending when the economy is growing. Thank you so much. I yield back my time.
Thank you, young lady, for yielding back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Raskin for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry that you were harangued again this morning about the origins of the coronavirus. I'm very eager also for the House Committee on Science to take up this scientific question and also deal with the fact that I have emphasized since the beginning that Donald Trump repeatedly defended the performance of the Chinese Communist Party and General Xi in COVID-19 in February, in March, in April, and May. For many months, I think on 19 different occasions, he defended them as doing a great job and a wonderful job in praising their partnership. So I'm very eager to get to the bottom of it, regardless of whether the virus came out negligently, recklessly, or deliberately. None of it excuses the lethal recklessness of Donald Trump in his complete mismanagement of the coronavirus in our country. And of course, we lost hundreds of thousands of people before he left office, and we got organized to crush the disease finally. Mr. Chairman, welcome to our committee. I was taken with something that you said in February when you said, what it takes to drive productive capacity to raise living standards over time is investment in people's skills and aptitudes, investment in plant and equipment, investment in software. Do you agree that investing in our nation's infrastructure will increase our productive capacity and contribute to long-term economic growth in the country?
Mr. Raskin, I want to start by saying I don't want to be seen to be addressing any particular legislative proposal, but I think it's basic economics that productivity is what and demographics are what drive longer-term growth in a country. And one of the big ways to affect productivity is through investment. And that includes infrastructure, includes plant equipment, in people, education, skills, things like that. So I think that is a point that I was making back in February.
Gotcha. Well, let me take a specific example then, and maybe you can help me with it. 30 million Americans live in areas with inadequate broadband, which severely limits their abilities to do their work, to develop their businesses, to participate equally in school. I've had high school kids tell me they have to go to McDonald's or Starbucks in order to get internet that they can use for their assignments. The American Jobs Plan would make unprecedented investments to expand broadband to these rural communities like Frederick and Carroll County in my district. And I know that you don't comment on specific legislative proposals, but would you say that in general, expanding high-speed broadband access to millions of Americans who don't have it, especially in rural areas, would create new economic opportunities and potential for long-term economic growth?
Again, without commenting on particular legislation, I think I would look at broadband like that in the same way that prior generations looked at electricity. If kids don't have access to the internet and to basically all the knowledge that's available through that, they're not going to be able to maximize their potential or realize their potential in this economy.
Well, I mean, that's a fascinating answer to me because when I tried to look at it historically, it seemed like the the definition of infrastructure has expanded over time. And, when Eisenhower said, let's build the highways, people said, what's that got to do with infrastructure? Infrastructure is bridges. And, when President Lincoln did the land grants to do university and colleges across the country, people said, what's that got to do with infrastructure? And so it does seem like the definition of infrastructure changes. What is your working definition of infrastructure as an economic concept?
I hadn't taken the trouble to really write one down, and I wouldn't like to do it in real time here, if I can avoid that.
Okay, well, or let me just pose it then in kind of a more abstract way. Would you say that infrastructure is anything that allows for the expansion of productive capacity and contribution to long-term economic growth?
I don't see anything objectionable about that.
Yeah. All right. Well, I just very much appreciate your emphasis on investment, because that's what we've been doing with the American Rescue Plan. That's what we want to do with the American Families Plan. That's what we want to do with the American Jobs Plan. We want to reinvest in America to keep those jobs here in America and to invest in our communities so we have a solid foundation for the continuing growth of the great American middle class and for the opportunity for lots of poor working people to get into the middle class. And with that, I will yield back to you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Jim, for yielding back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Jordan for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Chairman Powell, the Fed has two mandates, right?
Maximum employment and stable prices.
Maximum employment and stable prices. It seems like both got some problems today. I want to spend a little time on the first. Why are the jobs numbers so bad right now?
Well, I think we're digging out of a very deep hole. We've made a lot of progress, but I would agree with you. We have a long way to go.
Over 9 million job openings. Over the past 2 months, only 800,000 jobs added back. That's pretty bad. Is there a specific reason you point to as why those numbers aren't where we would frankly hope they would be?
It's a good question. And my thinking is that there are some temporary factors that are weighing on job creation. And I mentioned those earlier. Another thing is actual hiring is at very high levels, but it's being offset by high levels of quits and retirements. So what's happening is that the net job creation has been lower, but actual hiring is high. And that's, in a sense, quits is a good thing because people are looking for jobs that they want more. Retirements are just something that happens.
What about unemployment benefits? Does that factor in as well?
It may be a factor, and it'll be a temporary one because something like 15 million people will see either those benefits disappear or significantly decrease.
My understanding is the state unemployment plus the federal enhancements, $37,000 a year. Might that discourage people from going back to work?
We're going to find out. We're going to find out because it's going to be gone really quickly.
I think we are finding out. You add in the stimulus package, child tax credit, family of four, it's about $110,000. I mean, every single employer, literally every single employer I talk to in our district, and frankly, employers I talk to around the country tell me they can't find people to work. And you think it's more of quitting and retirements, or is it more unemployment, or a combination, or what is it?
I think in terms of things that are weighing on people getting in the labor force, I think it's those three things I mentioned. It's still some people are still afraid of COVID. Maybe they're living with someone who's vulnerable. It's also schools are closed still, and having schools be open again will free up a lot of caretakers. I think unemployment benefits too. I think you would expect a really strong set of jobs numbers coming up beginning in the next month.
Didn't you expect higher numbers? Didn't you expect higher numbers in April and May?
Yeah, I did.
Which, I mean, it sort of surprised me. I guess when you pay people not to work, you shouldn't be surprised when you don't have workers. I've never seen a situation like this where we now have, as the ranking member mentioned, we now have several governors, 25 I believe, who've turned back. We said we don't want the federal enhancement to unemployment. I've never seen that. I've been in politics 26 years. I've never seen governors turn down federal money. So I think that just underscores how serious the problem is. But you said you think it changes soon?
Well, we know that these benefits run out on the federal ones.
What if the Democrats renew them, which they're talking about doing?
Excuse me?
What if the Democrats renew them? That'd be a problem, wouldn't it?
Again, I don't comment on
No, when you said you expect it to run out and that will help, I'm asking you, that's not what Democrats are saying. They're talking about renewing them. And if it helps if they run out, if they renew them, won't that hurt?
Well, these are judgments for people who stand for.
No, I'm just following your logic. You said if it runs out, that will help the employment situation. I mean, I got employers.
I think we'll see strong job creation in the fall. I really do, and I think there are all these, as you point out, 9.3 million job openings, many millions of people unemployed. There seems to be some kind of a speed limit. It may just be that it's hard to match up with a new job, and people feel like they can wait a little bit longer and really shop carefully.
It seems to me, Chairman, and again, I know you're not going to comment on policies, but I don't know if the Democrats are doing anything right. They kept the economy locked down. They're spending money like crazy, proposing more, I think a $6 trillion budget the White House is proposing, all causing inflation. Inflation's went up the last 4 months, continues to increase. As you said, you got two mandates at the Fed, stable employment, low inflation. We got unstable employment, we got high inflation. And now they're paying people not to work, and that may continue. And then finally, on top of all that, they're thinking about raising taxes. I mean, this is amazing to me. First, you pay people not to work, and then the folks who are working, you're going to raise their taxes, and somehow they think that's going to help our economy, when, as I said now a couple times, every single employer I talk to tells me they can't find people to work. What do you think about all these policy ideas from the Democrats?
Again, it's not my job.
No, but your job is stable employment and low inflation. Right now we have 9 million job openings and inflation that's went up 5 months in a row. So something has to give. I'm not necessarily blaming you. I'm blaming the Democrat policies. And it seems to me the idea that they're going to extend the federal enhancement makes absolutely no sense. The idea they're going to raise taxes on hardworking Americans makes absolutely no sense. And the idea they're going to spend $6 trillion also makes absolutely no sense. So as I said, it seems to me they are doing everything wrong, making your job that much harder. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
It's a good thing, too.
I don't give comments when you make your statements. Tell me what I said wrong in that
statement. It's a good thing that you're yielding back so I can give 5 minutes to Mr. Foster.
It's a good thing I made those points about how bad the Democrat policies are. That's the good thing. And we'd like to answer, it'd be nice if the Fed chairman would answer the fact that if you guys extend unemployment, which he said if it goes away will be good for the economy, and if you extend it, he wouldn't answer that question.
With that, I yield 5 minutes to Mr. Foster.
Thank you, and I sympathize with the chairman sort of being left speechless by the logic that we just saw demonstrated. I'd also like to respond to some of my Republican colleagues about the origin of the coronavirus. The Science Committee Investigations and Oversight Subcommittee that I chair is in fact having a hearings on the origin of the coronavirus. The first is scheduled July 14th at 11 a.m. These hearings are going to be science-based, and I think it says a lot about how seriously my Republican colleagues take science that they cannot even find a complete set of members to serve on that committee, on that science subcommittee. They have only 2 members, the ranking member and Representative Sessions. With that out of the way, I just want to thank you, Chairman Powell, for your testimony. You correctly note the importance of the successful vaccination campaign. Under the Biden administration's leadership, we've now administered over 300 million vaccine doses, and COVID infections have fallen dramatically. The CDC has advised that vaccinated people can safely engage in a wide variety of activities, and states have been able to do that and ease coronavirus health restrictions. And when they do that, our economy recovers. I think it's clear to everyone that the return on our investment on vaccines, starting with money and directions provided by Congress before Operation Warp Speed was even announced, and following decades of federally funded research into the underlying science, has had the highest return on investment of really any that our country has ever made. Would you agree with that?
I don't have a number to put on that, but yes, I would think the return on investment would be high.
But the return on investment is not limited to vaccinating the United States. We also benefit economically by helping vaccinate our trading partners. Would you also agree that the return on that investment is likely to be very high?
I would, yes.
Yes, and would you be willing to have some of your brilliant economists that work for you actually try to put a rough number on that? because it's an important thing for us to appreciate as we decide how much of resources to devote to helping our other nations around the world.
I would be glad to do that.
Thank you. And now, with COVID, our economy has experienced a number of inflation shocks. The tight labor markets, commodity shortages, release of pent-up consumer demand, chip shortages, as you mentioned, due to underinvestment in foundries and overinvestment in Bitcoin and meme stocks. Proposals to move onshore the supply chains that have historically been offshore, which will, in general, increase prices. And all of this, however, happens against a continuing backdrop of long-term technological job loss that was arguably accelerated by COVID. So how do you think this is all going to net out when the transients are over, the longer-term, say medium-term effect of inflation?
I mean, it's incredibly hard to say, really. If you're positing an actual reversal of globalization, that could have implications, as you suggest. But I wonder if that's really going to happen because of policies that we adopt. The technology goes instantly on the world. It's not going to be easy to stop that. The economy's become very globalized. And also, production technology is so much more efficient than it was. You can do things, with the new technologies, you can manufacture things here. It may or may not result in a lot of jobs in manufacturing, but you can certainly make things. There may be reshoring here that's actually quite efficient in terms of cost.
So the jobs will come back to the U.S., but they'll be taken by robots, sort of is here. Which
there is some of that.
There's some of that, yeah.
In manufacturing, as you know.
Yeah, and so that's so you really maintain some uncertainty on how this is going to net out for the inflation.
A lot of uncertainty, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. And my last thing, you've been talking a little bit about high-speed broadband, which is, I think, an important investment with huge return. An important part of that is that when Americans get for the first time access to the internet, that they're also provided a secure digital ID that prevents them from becoming victims to identity fraud and allows them to safely participate in our economy. One of your other projects you're working on, central bank digital currencies, is going to need to have a secure digital ID to allow people to transact in digital dollars in a safe way that can't be abused. And are you working internationally to try to get these secure digital IDs, as part of your negotiations on central bank digital currencies and others?
I think it's part of the discussion. I would say we're not as far along as your description would suggest on that, but that's it's certainly something you would need to be able to have it.
Will it be addressed in your white paper coming out this summer?
A lot of things will be addressed. I'm not sure if that would be it. That's something you certainly need that to down the road. We probably will be. We're just laying it out right now.
Yeah, no, it's important for our economic recovery as well as planning to respond to China, frankly, on central bank digital currencies. So move it up on your to-do list. Thanks much, and I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding back. My understanding is that Dr. Green has joined us. If so, he's now recognized for 5 minutes.
Can you hear me, Mr. Chairman?
We now hear you, yes.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. Thank you, Chairman Clyburn and Ranking Member Scalise, and I want to thank Chairman Powell for being here today. Last summer when the former Fed chairs, Bernanke and now Treasury Secretary Yellen, testified before this subcommittee, I expressed some concern that the excessive spending by Congress and money printing by the Fed might cause inflation. Mr. Bernanke denied this, saying that people said there'd be inflation in 2008, but they were wrong. Mr. Chairman, the numbers are in, and it looks like there's some inflation, at least the past couple of months, 4 and now 5%. When Congress spends trillions of dollars and the Fed prints money, something's got to give. Prosperity isn't created by government. I don't believe it's created by workers, by businesses, by entrepreneurs. creating and inventing, innovating. I founded a healthcare company, grew that company up to over $200 million in annual revenue in just 8 years, and I have a little bit of experience on understanding how to create jobs, grow a business, et cetera. And I genuinely believe those businesses out there are looking at this inflation as a tax. Now, it's a hidden tax, but they see it as a tax on their ability to B2B transactions with B2 customer. Every dollar the government spends has to come out of somebody's pocket. Whether it's through another tax or a reduction in their purchasing power, it comes out. And if we don't get our fiscal house in order, I worry that inflation won't be transitory, as I know you've said both in the press and probably here today, and I apologize for being a little bit late. But my first question, Chairman Powell, are you concerned from an economic and really a national security perspective about Russia and China dumping the dollar and what appears to be a move to some kind of financial alliance between the two of them?
That's not something that's really within our bailiwick or on our radar screen. The dollar is the world's reserve currency. There really is no currency that's close to being able to compete. That's because of our democratic institutions and our record of maintaining low inflation, and because we have open capital markets and are great traders with the rest of the world. I don't see anything changing in that anytime soon.
Do you see the threat of raising the capital gains tax to 40% as a challenge to those capital markets?
And again, I really don't comment on tax and spending proposals. We don't have any authority over that. Whatever the level of capital gains tax is something that is the business of elected officials, not the business of the Fed.
I appreciate that. Over the past 10 years, the federal government's net interest costs have grown about 25% relative to GDP, despite the historically low interest rates. If spending remains on its current trajectory and interest rates reach their historic average of 5.7%, do you think the federal government will be able to pay its bills?
I have no question that the U.S. government will be able to pay its bills for the foreseeable future. There's no case in which that would not be the case. We have the strongest and largest and most flexible economy in the world. It's also true, though, that we're on an unsustainable path and that we're going to have to address that. And as I mentioned, the time to address that is when the economy is strong, unemployment is low, and economic activity is high.
Is it possible that the high interest rate that we're seeing today is the start of something that could be as bad as the 70s? And if not, could you explain why?
You say higher interest rates or higher inflation?
Inflation. I'm sorry if I misspoke.
Very, very unlikely. What we're seeing now, we believe, is inflation in particular categories of goods and services that are being directly affected by this unique historical event that none of us has lived through before, called reopening the economy after closing it. So you see extremely strong demand for labor, for goods, for services, and you see the supply side caught a little bit flat-footed and trying to catch up. And you see bottlenecks and you see this all over the world, by the way. This is not just the United States. You see it everywhere, and it's very similar kinds of situations. And you have a central bank that's committed to price stability and has defined what price stability is and is strongly prepared to use its tools to keep us around 2% inflation. So all of those things suggest to me that an episode like what we saw in the 1970s, and I graduated from college in 1975. I had a front row seat. That nothing like that. I don't expect anything like that to happen.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I can't see the clock, unfortunately. I don't know if I have any more time.
You are out of time.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Thank you for yielding back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Christian Martha for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chairman Powell, for appearing before us. Back in 2019, you said the following. You said, we try to create a strong labor market. For many, many people and many, many communities, that's enough. But for people who are at the margins, the low to moderate income community, that's not enough. They need a chance. And earlier that year, you said you were cutting rates in part to help those who are, quote, left behind. How do you see the impact of the pandemic on these groups of people for whom you expressed empathy and concern back in 2019? And how do you see the recovery affecting them?
Well, in the first instance, the pandemic hit the service industries very hard. Industries that involve dealing with the public, hotels, travel, entertainment, and the people in those customer-facing, public-facing jobs. They tend to be relatively low-paid jobs, and their minorities and women are significantly overrepresented among the people in those jobs. And that's who got laid off. Most of the layoffs, a big chunk of the layoffs, disproportionately, were in those industries. So it's clear this pandemic really hit those people hard. And why it was even more painful was that in the last couple of years of the very long expansion that ended in March of 2020, longest in our history, you really began to see benefits going more to those groups than to the high end. I mean, wage gains at the lower end of the income spectrum were bigger than they were at the higher end. That began to be the case in year 8, 9, 10, and the 11th year. And that was a very positive thing. And high labor force participation, the benefits of prosperity being spread widely, and it could have gone on for a long time, but for the pandemic. So we have the pandemic, and those industries are hiring people back. A whole lot of the job creation we're seeing is in those industries. You're still several million short in those industries of where employment was, but they're really high, very large numbers of job openings in a number of industries, including the service industry. So I really am hopeful with the strength of labor demand. It really is remarkably strong. That over time, and not a lot of time, this will sort itself out, and we'll find ourselves in a very, very strong labor market with low unemployment, wages going up across the spectrum.
Can I jump in for one moment, which is thank you for that answer. You were talking about the matching function that's happening right now between people who are perhaps dislocated and people who, the job openings that exist. What is your perspective on efforts by educational systems working with governments, state, local, federal, in upskilling people to match them with the jobs that currently exist in the post-pandemic economy through skills-based education or career technical education and the like?
I've been exposed to a number of programs of that nature, and they seem to work really well. Some of them do anyway. The idea being companies, you actually see it in South Carolina quite a bit. You see companies teaming up with schools and technical schools in these apprenticeship programs, and they really work. I would say that's a great idea, and it would be great to see more of it all over the country. But those things take time. They take policy support. They'll take time to really build and produce value. Whereas this is something we have the immediate need to get people back to work.
Yes, sir. Last question. What is the impact of other countries in the world not getting their populations vaccinated at the rate that we are? And
如果大家不想听了的话，就先不听了。我看今天也就那么回事儿。这个我瞅眼看看这个英文直播间里面，就是这个雅虎直播这些人，就是哪个国家都有的这些人聊的这些东西，也全都是瞎扯淡，也没什么一点有用的消息都没有啊。大家不听的话就算了，这个现在是3点24分啊，3点24分，这个抓紧时间看一看现在的股市情况，看一看股市的情况。我把这个软件打开，我先看一看有什么其他的。有朋友在问减仓啊，减仓先不太用，说实话，减仓就先不太用啊，因为这个今天比较扯皮，但是在有限的讲话当中，还是给了一些市场的这种时间啊，还是给了一种这个市场更多的这种比较坚定的信心，所以减仓我个人觉得至少短期内不太需要， 如果不出意外的话，周三、周四、周五应该是一个非常平稳的温和上涨，尤其是在这个纳斯达克已经创出新高的基础之上。讲一讲一航是吧？一航我还没买，我在等着，但是我自己现在还没买，应该这么说啊。一航在这样的位置上进行盘整了好多天了，我个人不觉得它到了我自己可以接受的这个目标价位，所以我自己还没有买入，在等着。好，我们继续看看 NIO 接近100天均线了，这位置止损不好吧？ NIO 下跌了很多吗？在讲话的过程中，早晨看的时候是4%、5%的样子啊，我们看一看现在的情况。先已经把这个都关掉了，看一看 NIO 现在的情况。大家的市值应该都还可以吧？我这边自己的市值今天涨得也比较明显。目前为止2个账户各涨了3点几，所以今天也都还可以啊。NIO 我个人其实在刚开始第一场直播的时候说了，不太担心了，我也不觉得应该去什么止损啊，现在不太着急。非常正常的连续性上涨之后回调2天，比较正常。再去看别的啊，一航说过了，NIO 也说过了。行，我看留言的问题差不多就这么多。纳指100是吧？纳指100今天应该看看纳指这些大块头应该看得出来啊。TDD 在上涨哦，说 TDD 了，我稍微给大家提示一下 ，TDD 也是啊。TDD 这3-4天的走势是标准的这个拆股之后的走势啊。拆股之后的走势，所以如果大家想去考虑这个英伟达拆股之后，由于散户买入的力量可能会带来的走势 ，TDD 是一个比较好的参照物。看一下 APPN 好像现在跌了6点几，7%是吧？啊，6点几啊。Jerry 不用特别担心，看一看明天有没有机会回调到，比如说这个125块钱，或者是甚至可能会调到比如说123块钱之类的这样的价格啊。不用担心，这个连续性上涨的股票在一天的时间里面，所谓的用时间换空间，换句话说就是当天下跌的幅度比较大，为后市这种缩短回调时间，然后开始尽快的向上反弹，创出这种空间上的机会是可以的啊，没有问题。所以想杀入的话，明天如果继续像它今天这么个跌势，跌了6点几，明天开盘应该还有继续向下的动力。开盘向下动力的时候，如果机会合适的话，到时候可以咱们在这个会员群里面再聊啊，我随时可能会跟大家说我自己在这只股票上的操作。Macy's 今天挺稳的 ，Macy's 昨天上涨了2.几3%是吧？今天不继续又上涨吗？还是说啊，这个其实 Macy's 之前的下跌到现在，整体上也是跟这个道琼斯指数的走势非常相关啊。我们回过头来看一看道琼斯的指数，三大股指现在没完了，直接向上了。所以其实咱们怎么说的呀？上周四、上周五我就说要反弹了，对吧？虽然我不知道是从周一开始就一定会从周一开始反弹，但是连续10连跌之后，如果你那个时候再去选择割掉你道琼斯手里的那些股票，对吧？就有点不明智了。因为什么不太好，建议朋友们一定不要割呢？如果比如说周一跌了，你等周二、周一又有人说，哎呀，你看你周五不让我卖，周一你不让我卖道指里面的股票，周一又跌了，我又损失了3%。所以有时候不太好说，我只能给大家分析我自己的思路和对这个市场的把握。大家呢结合自己的这种持仓也好啊，仓位情况也好，自己去把握。SQQQ 呢现在是这样的啊，今天这个讲话完了之后，做空市场的动力就不太强了。一部分的空头可能就会自己就撤了。今天这个讲话讲完之后，因为在接下来的一段时间里面啊，就常规的这些经济数据了，真正的这种大规模的，就是比较有影响力的这种讲话呀，或者其他的这种相关的新闻呢，就不太会出现了。除非什么呢？继续可能下一回会 比如说发布一些 MOMC 的这种会议纪要之类的，但也是就是说隔了一段时间之后再重新去回看在周一周二上周一上周二这个开会的这些纪要也是老生常谈，所以目前看市场上想去大幅度的回调或者是走出这种上涨，这叫什么？这种下杀式的走势应该不太可能，尤其是道琼斯指数。APP 刚才说过了，会继续跌吗？我觉得明天可能还会有一些惯性下跌。如果明天企稳了的话，就应该是加仓的机会。Macy's 可以买入吗？我个人觉得可以买入，没什么问题啊。想买的话买一点，没什么问题。今天又都站上了所有的短期均线，我觉得应该可以。大盘普涨就3傻跌，嗨，不能那么说啊，咱们不能那么说。大盘跌的时候3傻涨得多强啊，人家都涨了50%了，小朋友涨了100%了，还不允许人家下跌2天，下跌个5%、6%的，对吧？这个正常啊，正常。Amazon 要卖吗？ Amazon 想卖就可以卖掉了，因为我说的也非常清楚啊，这一波强反弹、强短线的反弹就是在 Prime Day 之前啊。当然，如果你继续看好 Amazon， 继续看好这个7月20号这个 Bezos 上天之前，市场对于这个事情，包括对于整个亚马逊的炒作的话，你可以拿着，但是跟我们强反弹的逻辑已经就不是同一个逻辑了，已经不是同一个逻辑了。就像之前咱们说抢 Twitter 反弹、抢苹果的反弹是一样的。苹果卖吗？我觉得可以卖了啊，我个人认为是可以卖。为什么说可以卖呢？主要是因为一个是这段时间的这种反弹不错，另外一方面纳指在各方面的努力下，无论是纳指100里面的这种龙头，还是其他各行各业的这种科技股都不错，也创了新高了。也许在未来的1-2天啊，也许啊，周3、周4呢，纳指慢慢的呢还会向上有些动力，因为什么呢？刚刚创了新高，对吧？这口气还在，还希望继续表现一下。如果这种像 Apple 啊、Google 啊、什么 Microsoft 这样的公司能够再给力，把指数稳定住，对吧？再向上窜一窜，毕竟刚刚创出新高，但是再表现1-2天之后就应该开始回调了，VLD2 问的挺多的，因为 VLD2 自从说进了这个罗素2000之后，表现的也一般，连续性的这样的下跌之后开始在低位震荡。如果你想买入，可以买入，简单的说啊，可以买入。出行股走的好，对啊，刚才鲍威尔也在讲了，这种跟 travel 相关的，跟这种这种服务业相关的。SE 现在会太高吗？问 SE 的是听咱们节目的 SE 是好股票，我自己也一直在说，前天刚创出来历史新高呢，高肯定是高，对吧？高肯定是高，但是我希望你在 SE 上已经赚钱了。我之前说过很多次的 SQ 跟 SE 了，对吧？不建议现在这个价位再买了，再买就没什么意思。CHPT 可以买吗？ CHPT 昨天你没买，今天再买会不会有点？今天还可以啊，今天也是冲高回落了，想买可以买点啊。如果今天冲高回落的话，想买可以买点。我还觉得今天 CHPT 会这个上午看的时候还涨了几个点，涨了2个点还是3个点，忘了。如果现在回调如果手里一点没有 CHPT 啊，想买就买一点。AMD 就先算了 ，AMD 先不买了。BLNK 1分钱跌了1分钱被套了，哇，这个1分钱心理压力太大了，居然被套了1分钱。出行股走的话我们说过了 ，VLD2 说过了。Fastly 嘛，好了，咱们现在已经是3点35了，咱们再说5分钟，3点40咱们就结束了。今天整个2场直播说的时间比较长。Fastly 66的成本，感觉最近反弹还行。最近反弹呢，行呢，确实是还可以，但是成交量不高，而且呢没有拉出来大阳线。这个另外一个呢，主要是你的66块钱有点尴尬，为什么呢？它65块5毛钱的120天均线，到了均线之后应该会，还别说它先能不能到啊？如果它向上到的话，在你这个成本价位上就会开始有压力。其实说实话，我对发斯里自己也不是特别的感冒吧，对这家公司也不是特别的感冒。我还是觉得有更好，比它更好的标的。 好了，我们再向上看一看，今天苹果的量没有跟上，是不是应该慢一半？苹果可以走，刚才刚说完，可以走。Dirty politics, shameless politicians， 嗨，这就不错了。其实我今天在这个 Sasha， 我其实今天自己在看直播的时候就在想一个问题啊，就是说美国至少还能够给你现场直播这样关于 politician 比较难看的一面，还能让你直播。这就算是呢，这就算是比较开明了。我相信很多的地方可能都做不到，或者没有勇气去进行这样的直播，对吧 ？JP Morgan 呢，其实说的很多了，每一次就是最近结合了 JP Morgan 也好，或者说其他大金融时，我都说了我对大金融的看法了。我并不是特别看好大金融在这一段时间的走势啊。我也说了，对大金融来说，也许你等上个2-3个月，到今年的4季度。临近比如说开始有这种调整利息的就是 interest rate 的这种预期的时候，你再介入会好一点。整个我不是特别看好这个大金融行业最近的走势啊。确定这是纳指新高吗？1450才到新高？没有啊，这个纳指新高就是12421吧，我记得之前的前期新高是12421，看一眼啊。前期的新高，如果没记错，应该是12421啊，就是在这个位上，对啊，12421嘛。现在是14258，已经破掉了历史新高。感谢 Vicky 的打赏，辛苦了，喝杯咖啡，非常感谢啊，感谢 Vicky。然后再看特斯拉能加仓吗？特斯拉，我自己不会加仓特斯拉，说的直接一点，我自己不会。大家知道NIO 今年预计什么时候港股上市吗？rumor 说是3季度是吧？港股上市对美股不太会有影响啊，有的话也是正面的影响，不用特别的担心。Blink。Blink 跟 CHBD 今天都稍微有，其实不是今天啊，这2-3天结合了周五的4、5日都连续3天都有所回调，但是回调的幅度非常小，应该说非常的小，没有什么可说的，非常正常。还是那句话，在这个之前连续性的上涨了这么多之后，稍微有几天的回调也是蛮健康也蛮正常的。特斯拉还会继续涨势吗？特斯拉不觉得会大涨。3Run 现在可以买入吗？3Run 昨天其实好多人都在咱会员群里问，对吧？我说想买，昨天就买了。今天这又涨了4个点了，可不可以买入？我个人认为后市只要能够成功的突破120日的均线，后市还应该有机会，这是我个人的看法。关于3Run，但是你昨天如果没有勇于加仓的话，今天买是不是就心里有点变？只要你能管控好自己的心态，还是可以买，我觉得还是可以买。BEN 能开仓吗？看金融好像止跌看金融好像止跌是吧？刚借着说这个叫什么呀 ？JP Morgan 的时候说了金融板块的看法，对吧？所以，而且呢，关键是你买入 BEN 这样的金融股啊，不管它是大金融也好，还是这种就是市值是算是 middle 或者算是这种 small 也好 middle 也好那种 capitalization 的这样的金融股啊，你看中的是什么？你看中的是它的短期的反弹，还是看中的是中长线，或者说是比如说以3个月为期，你认为它会有比较不错的这样的走势？如果你认可的是说，我一直拿着这种金融板块的股票，我呢也不用特别担心短期的波动，我一直拿下去，涨跌呢我也不太在意，可以买一点。否则的话，如果你真的是天天盯着股市啊，你不一定能拿得住，因为你天天盯着它没有操作呢，看着别的板块。今天它涨，明天充电桩涨，今天清洁能源涨，后天基建板块涨，你不一定拿得住金融板块的标的，除非你就不看市场。可以，感谢剑影的打赏。DDD 今天拉爆了 ，DDD 是不是已经30%多了 ？DDD 是今天我自己操作非常不好的，没买进去28%，今天差不多也就这样。 Plug 可以加仓吗？财报出来加了76%，那 Plug 今天真的是猛啊，真的是猛。是这样啊 ，Plug 呢还是说有点负面啊，就是说这个公司基本面有点负面。今天呢，确实是成交量也在放大，也上涨了10%几。如果你想去建仓或者是加仓呢，你看一下明天它会不会冲高之后就开始重拾弱势，开始回落。如果它明天收盘之前，或者说明天比如在白天的时候进行震荡，但是不跌破它现在的120天均线，也就是说向下不跌破32.4块、32.5块，应该在这个位置上有企稳，等待着下一波的拉升，或者这一轮慢慢的开始逐渐的向上拉升，这个时候你再进。如果明天一上来开始向下回调，突破了这个32块4毛钱也没有反弹的话，那最好还是别入啊。因为像你说的，如果真的是第一季度财报出来之后业绩增长76%，现在股价才上涨12%，很一般啊。而且今天的成交量没有放到特别的大，很一般啊，很一般，中规中矩的表现。好了，我们现在这个3点41了，我们最后再说CCL 跟 X，CCL 跟 X 想买都可以买一点，这是 Angela 的问题。然后再说这个 NUSI 我不是特别清楚这个股票，看这个代码我自己不是特别的清楚，咱们看一眼啊。今天就用 NUSI 作为这个最后的一个个股了。反弹的这个技术走势和现在上涨的这个技术走势以及量价配合都很好啊，都很好。昨天这个成交量放大，今天成交量也非常健康，并且走出这种全天上涨的走势啊。当然今天是因为这个可能是低开了之后全天上涨，现在涨了0.几，但整个的走势非常健康，沿着均线一路向上啊，一路向上。所以这个我不知道这个美股的被动收入之路是这位朋友这个持仓成本是多少，但是走出这样的走势，安心持有啊，没有任何的问题，安心持有啊，不要被它的这种短期的波动就把自己，还是那句话，这种沿着均线稳步向上的，没有破坏上升通道走势的股票，正常持有，而且呢，实际上走出了一个比较长时间的 W 型。大家应该可以看得到啊，对于 NUSI 这只股票走出了非常明显的 W 型，而且现在的价位呢，就是 W 中间这颗线的高点即将突破 W 中间的高点。如果成功突破的话，一般来说从技术图形上的走势来说，很有可能会直接去挑战前期的高点，形成这种走出这种双顶，甚至说突破啊，甚至突破，所以安心持有这只股票。APPN 余兴刚才说了，一上来就说了 APPN 啊，这个今天不用管它，看看明天能不能止跌，止跌之后开始考虑建仓，不是开始考虑建仓，开始考虑加仓。APPN 今天跌了6%，对吧？看一看明天能不能反弹啊？也不是反弹，明天能不能企稳？如果企稳的话，问题就不太大。120、124啊、125这样的价格就差不太多了。APPN 好吧，好了，我们今天直播就做到这里啊，3点44了。这个感谢大家的支持啊，感谢大家的支持，这么多位朋友一直陪着我们看这个直播，然后再聊天，谢谢大家支持。咱们呢明天准时还是那个时间见。整个来说，这一周的股市的情况应该不错，不用特别的担心。有什么事情呢？可以在我们这个视频